But before I move forward, I know that this session is being recorded, and just sort of a disclaimer that although I work with Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, the views expressed by me are my own and not necessarily that of the organization. I mean, of course, under this climate, such disclaimers become mandatory. Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, is the new global framework. It's the version 2.0. I mean, you've already spoken about it over the past day and a half, the MDGs and all. And MDGs were, 8 goals, 18 targets, just cannot deal with the gamut of, global development issues. Also, I mean, the rumor has it, and there's some sort of truth to it, is that the MDGs were decided, by technocrats in a UN basement, over some coffee and, meetings in the hallways, and there is some truth to it. But that's where, and it's totally top down. I mean, that's what it tells you. And as Mitu had already mentioned, that it used to be only the developing countries' prerogative or responsibility, rather. In that sense, SDGs really fundamentally change. At least on paper, they change the narrative, because now civil society is a massive stakeholder. I mean, it's there on paper, at least, to begin with. And so that's the thing. The other thing that, is different, I mean, the problem was with the MDGs. That is something that I mentioned in one of the, a high-level panel last year, is that the MDGs failed because, no one ever lost their job because of not meeting a target. And that kind of, half tongue-in-cheek comment really makes people uncomfortable, especially when you are sitting amongst UN folks and government officials. But not that SDGs are legally binding, but there is more stakeholdership, more partnership, more folks are being sort of brought into this compact. You have civil society, you have private sector, you have media, you have academicians. So I think it just makes more sense that something this ambitious can only be done by that many people and not just one thing. And this is already there, on paper in the UN resolution. Has been inserted. But so on the and also what is really fundamental in the SDGs is the follow-up and review mechanism, which wasn't quite there in the MDGs. MDGs, governments were supposed to just report, and that's about it. Whereas here, it's almost a 3-tier, review and follow-up mechanism, which just goes through every year and supposed to go over the next 15 years. How is it done? The governments are expected to sort of, review their progress, bring multi-stakeholders, all the stakeholders rather, to develop national action plans. Now, these action plans are done in a consultative manner. Once these plans are made and then they're reviewed and the progress is reviewed at a national level, they feed into the next tier, which is a regional level. So the UN has 5 regional commissions across the world. There is the Africa Commission, there is Caribbean and Latin America, there is Western Asia, there is Europe, and there is Asia and Pacific. Yeah, the SCAP. So I and some of my colleagues here, we deal mainly with the UN SCAP, which is based in Bangkok. So what happens is the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development, which is hosted by the UN SCAP in Bangkok, it meets annually usually in the last week of March. And this is actually, it was sort of a defunct commission for a long time, but the SDGs have kind of revitalized it, because this is a useful forum, because it's a smaller grouping. You only have around like 35 countries participating in it. It's better equipped thus to tackle with the critical issues of SDGs. It also gives civil society and other stakeholders more room for engagement with government officials and the UN system. So that's the sort of the middle tier. And from there, they create roadmaps for SDG implementation for their region, which then feeds into the HLPF, the High-Level Political Forum. I mean, this is the UN. There are lots of acronyms, and sometimes it's a bit confusing, but, such as the UN. But the HLPF is when, things really get sort of, exciting and kind of heated up. And so HLPF happens every year. It usually is in the first fortnight of July. And it has two components, and I think that's where some confusion often occurs. There is one component of the HLPF which is about the global thematic review. Because there are 17 goals, every year all 17 goals can't be reviewed, so they have sort of clubbed it out to 4 goals this year, 5 goals this year, and the objective is to cover all 17 goals over a period of 4 years. Parallel to that is the voluntary national review. That's something that you've already heard about, even in the previous session, is that countries are expected, encouraged, in UN language, to present their reviews on how they've been faring with implementing SDGs. Now, that's the essential global follow-up and review mechanism. But what is actually happening at VNRs? So far, which is 2016 and 2017, so far there have been 65 countries that have presented their VNRs, out of which only 34 countries presented on all 17 goals. So the remaining, which is almost another half, they've been cherry picking, just as Meetu rightly said, that cherry picking goal has become the norm. They're basically choosing the goals that they want to present on, and most importantly, omitting the ones that they find uncomfortable. And I find, and what you see is that the most uncomfortable goals are goal number 10 on inequality and goal number 16 on access to justice and human rights. And I work on goal 16, and that's why I feel like I need to give those disclaimers out when I speak in public like this. But also, so last year was India's VNR. It was, it was pretty disappointing. India presented only on 7 out of 17 goals. 7 out of 17 goals, and it just and basically turned the entire process, which was supposed to be a review and a discussion, into a PR process of its own. It just basically mentioned all the laws, the schemes, the policies, and the program that it has in place, without actually focusing on the crux of the matter, which is how they are being implemented, which we know is a very different story, and what we are probably most interested in, to know that how that which is on paper is translated on ground. And to sort of, rub salt to the wound, exactly as someone mentioned earlier, that India prevented its civil society from even asking any questions. It's really not a peer review then, it's just a one-way discussion, which is, well, we are getting more and more familiar with it in this country now. So, so government performance at HLPF and, and engagement with the review process was disappointing. But then, those of us who've been sort of, engaging with, SDGs and, government of India, we sort of, we were kind of prepared. We weren't expecting something too different from what we've been noticing, because prior to an HLPF, prior to a VNR, there's a whole process of consultative meetings. You build the report together. I mean, it's owned by the government, but it's also owned by the people. But that really wasn't happening. We had national consultations on different goals, but they were rather perfunctory in nature. I remember, I think Deepak and I, we were there during the goal number 10 national consultation, and the whole conversation was sort of hijacked, to take it to a small point of, remittances, which is one of the targets in goal number 10, but actually leaving out the foundation, which is inequality. And, again, it's an uncomfortable question. Let's not deal with it. So that was the thing. And also, like, the HLPF, the VNR happened in July 2017. Just 2 months before that was the UPR, that India's third round of UPR. And, I mean, it almost was a primer to what was about to happen in what happened in Geneva was a primer to what was going to happen in New York, because the Attorney General presented his, opening statements, and basically, in one of the lines, without batting an eyelid, he said that torture is alien to Indian culture. To which my, tweet in response was, after hearing Mukul Rohatgi read out India's UPR statement, I wanted to live in the country he was describing. Anyway, enough of government bashing. It's become so cliche that it's not even fashionable anymore. This brings me to the solution part of it, And I think this is where the things get really interesting, because despite all the problems that there are with, SDGs, the fact that, I alluded to it earlier, that the role of civil society and data, and I feel like that's where, it really comes together. But what is it? I mean, what is the right? I mean, apart from like being a rightful stakeholder, how is that sort of realized, beyond its rhetoric? The way I see it, and some of you may disagree with me here, is that the civil society, the yous and me's here, we are not the implementers. We don't have the resources. Whatever, when we implement, we do it at a very micro level, which is really not, adding to the development. To implementing SDGs. We can't provide safe and clean drinking water to all. We can't do establish quality education and healthcare for everyone in this country. But at best, or at most rather, what we can do is that we can be knowledge and policy partners to the government, when they're deciding, their action plans. However, what the civil society can and is best suited to do is to hold the government accountable, be the ears and eyes, the watchdogs, so to speak, and pressure the government or goad the government, whatever language one wishes to use depending on their sort of advocacy strategies, is to pressure the government to do what it's supposed to do. So that's the role of civil society, the way I see it. And when you add that to the vast and intricate sort of data and indicator framework, which accompanies SDGs, I feel like the two marries really well. I won't go into the details of data and indicator framework. I think some of it was probably discussed in one of the sessions yesterday. But what I will definitely say is that the strongest tool for seeking accountability lies in that data framework. And it's the basis of what we in civil society, in the NGO sector, call evidence-based advocacy. It's also been sort of repeated in the SDG literature often, that what gets measured gets done. Something of that was alluded earlier as well, but it's not a straightforward thing as I may make it sound to be. A lot depends on the existing data infrastructure, the framing of indicators, the granularity of data, and by which I mean that it's not enough to say that the literacy rate in India is 73%. How do we break it down? How do we disaggregate to know that actually less than 50% is the literacy rate amongst the Dalit population in India? So that kind of granularity we need, to make the invisible visible again. For example, and also like this is the place where, because of this, because of the data framework, we also have a massive opportunity to actually fill the gap where the gaps exist. For example, the existing global SDG 16 indicator for access to justice is proportion of people reporting their victimization to competent authorities, which basically translates as crime reporting rate. But we also know from experience, and just talking to our friends and families and everywhere that we come across in our day-to-day life, is that crime, there's a huge amount or significant proportion of crimes are not reported to the police. If they are reported, the FIRs are not registered. If FIRs are registered, then arrests are not made. If arrests are made, then court appearances are not happening because of massive backlogs in cases. If court appearances occur, then convictions are not produced. So in that case, the global indicator just cannot be the criterion to assess access to justice. Likewise, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation is tasked to formulate goals in national indicators in India. They haven't been published as yet, but I have come to find out from people in the inside, is that there are two indicators for access to justice in India. One is number of police personnel per 100,000 population, and number of judges per 100,000 population. So obviously we can sort of gather that this is really not getting into the crux of the issue, that this is not access to justice. So when there is such huge lacunae in in indicators and data framework, it also gives us the opportunity to actually fill that gap. Some time back, it was this sort of drawback was actually turned into an opportunity, because now we actually can make a space for supplementary indicators, and that's an area that I and some of colleagues in CHRI are working on, is to understand that these indicators are not enough. We know it; it's acknowledged widely. So, what can we do to add more indicators, make it more robust? So thus I feel like the debate now needs to move beyond what is, but moving towards citizen-generated data, and that's something that I mean, it's a controversial area. There are no guidelines, but I also feel that this is a place that if the discussion moves, then at least more conversation can happen to actually figure out what the parameters of citizen-generated data can be. And here I'm not talking about big data. Big data is something that is very fashionable to speak about. It's more of a corporate speak. But I'm talking about small data, very small data. But when you add the people, the number of people who are producing such small data, you actually end up with a very large quantity of data. And just as a quick example, I'd say that every day I walk to my office. Yes, I'm one of those privileged people who can walk to office in Delhi, and I cross a drain which is gets worse during summer and monsoon months. It's like a sort of our neighborhood headquarters for waterborne diseases, chikungunya, dengue, name whatever. Um, but the thing is that despite making complaints, there is complete apathy from the municipality that nothing gets done. But what do you do? I mean, you can't say the evidence is not that I've made 4 complaints. That's not the evidence. The evidence actually comes when you just take out your cell phone, your smartphone, which has a camera, and you every day take the same photograph at the same time. You can even put a watch in front of your camera and make it date stamp it. You could put a newspaper and date stamp it. And when you have 60 days of photographs, it becomes irrefutable evidence. I mean, this is an idea. There are 100 holes in that idea. Morphing is one of them, of course. But it's a conversation starter also. So that's what I'm saying. So the way forward to a large extent is the alliance between civil society, governments, creating new kinds of data, non-traditional data. And just to conclude, I'd say that SDGs, it's a matter of perspective also. I mean, do you see this as something very transformational that will change the development discourse, or is it just another UN rhetorical hullabaloo? But and it's also naive to say that in a sort of Francis Fukuyama way that this is the end of development. There is going to be more. It cannot eradicate poverty for all. There is going to be a post 2030 agenda, but what that post 2030 agenda is going to be will be determined by the blueprint that has been created by SDGs, by creating a vast network of indicators, of matrices, of data, of stakeholders who can actually start feeding into a process. So whatever the post 2030 agenda may look like, you already have a blueprint which actually can feed into the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to make a brief comment, we talked about this in the last panel as well, about the non-legally binding SDGs, which generally is true. But let me also say that if you are a human rights lawyer or if you are a law student and you want a law, there are plenty of legal texts that are legally binding. Go to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is binding. Everything in human rights is binding. So the domestic Indian law, you have plenty of texts that you can also use to defend violations of human rights. So if SDGs don't help you, don't get despair. You have everything else which you can make a very strong legal case in the courtroom. Let's move to Kaveri and her brilliant students. Congratulations, by the way. We should do this more often when we can bring our students next to us in our presentations. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm Deepshi, a student doing Masters in Public Policy. For today's presentation, my classmates, Chandrika, Priya, Sheetal and I, we would like to talk about a policy brief that we've worked on with Professor Kaveri, which is based on her research with the Udupi fisher women in Karnataka. So this policy brief is part of her research, and thus the presentation that we're making today is completely empirical. So Mr. Radhakrishnan discussed how you would like to know how the SDGs are implemented. So hopefully this presentation would show you how that happens. So women fish sellers in Udupi are referred to as fisherwomen, and that's how we refer to them as well. These fisherwomen belong to the Mogavira caste, which is a lower caste, and they engage in selling fish locally. Now, despite India's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, and more specifically to poverty reduction, gender equality, and sustainable livelihoods, we see these women are under constant threat because of capital-intensive shops like these supermarkets. And there's very little the government does. They do use the language of protection of livelihoods to refuse licenses to these supermarkets, but that's it. There's nothing more that's being done. Further, culturally, these women are referred to as doing a reproductive activity. That is, they're just putting food on the table. Even though they're engaging in something that's economic, they're only viewed as, and this is a tendency of the state of Karnataka as well, to view them as doing something that is reproductive rather than something that is economic. And with the setting up of the Sustainable Development Goals, there has been an increase in these poverty reduction schemes that are aimed towards women. Like, for instance, we have these microcredit schemes for women that, even though they're aimed at women, they're actually benefiting the families. So in a sense, these women are instrumentalized. But you see there's a discord in the case of these Udupi fisher women, where all the state's policies are aimed towards fishermen. Now, drawing from Professor Marx's talk yesterday, he spoke of this tension between the goals of economic growth and poverty reduction. In the case of these fisher women, we see that this takes place where the economic growth is superseded the poverty reduction schemes of the state. Now, these women are more vulnerable to compared to the fishermen during the state-imposed ban, simply because all the policies of the state are aimed towards these fishermen. And it is important to point at this juncture that a portion of the catch of these fishermen contributes to the exports. So perhaps one of the reasons why only their work gets recognized by the government, and the women's work is considered natural, and it's only something that they do naturally rather than being economic. Chandrika now will speak about the current policies and the problems in the coastal states.
Good afternoon. I'm Chandrika, and as Dipshi said, I will be speaking about the current policy situation on marine fishing in the states of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. So, in the fisheries sector, a fisherman is defined as a person directly engaged in professional full-time fishing. Therefore, it is only the men who are considered as directly employed in the marine fisheries, whereas persons engaged in retail sales of the fish or other light activities such as processing or cleaning the fish, or even net makers are considered as allied workers. And if not all, but most of these allied workers are the fisherwomen. So due to this reason, a lot of benefits that are given to the fishermen are not inclusive of the women. So the policies of the states that we studied, we have categorized them in two categories. First is the social security benefits, and second is the immediate economic needs that should be provided to the fishermen due to the state-imposed ban on fishing. So every year for about 45 to 61 days during the monsoon season, which also happens to be the breeding season of the marine fish, the state imposes a ban on marine fishing. This is mostly due to protect the fishermen from injuries and also deaths, because during that time the ocean is particularly more dangerous, and also to conserve the marine fish, the population of the marine fish. And this ban is a big financial crisis for these fisher families, as 61% of these fisher families are under the poverty line. The social security benefits include insurance, compensation for injuries, old age pension, marriage, funeral cover, death natural deaths or death while fishing, or when fishermen go missing in the ocean. Such compensations come under the social security benefits that the states provide. For the immediate economic needs of the fisher folk during the ban season, different states give different kinds of compensations or special allowances during the snow fishing period. And other than this, there is a scheme that the central government has floated called the Savings Cum Relief Scheme. In this, it's a monetary scheme to help the fishermen. The fishermen are supposed to give a certain amount of money to the government, which is then matched by the central and state government equally. This is done during the active fishing period, and while the ban comes about, then this amount, the whole sum, is given back to the fishermen as a relief amount. So at the moment, the government of Karnataka fails to help these people during the financial crisis, even though it's a state-imposed ban. And Karnataka provides no benefits, be it a social security benefit or any immediate economic help. Whereas Kerala provides a social security benefit in terms of the Savings Cum Relief Scheme, but it's only provided to the men. And other than that, some benefits, the social security benefits are given to the registered fishermen and allied workers, while the savings cum relief is given to only the men. Yes, and other than that, Tamil Nadu has been quite progressive in its policies. Tamil Nadu provides economic security to all men or women, and it also has Tamil Nadu has Tamil Nadu provides immediate economic relief by way of compensations and savings cum relief scheme to both fishermen and women, and social security benefits to fisher families. So Tamil Nadu has been progressive, and this is owing to the Jayalalitha regime where there were pro-poor welfare measures, and also there were various social movements of fisher women in Tamil Nadu during the 1990s. Priya will now tell us some. Priya will talk about how this present policy situation has been blatantly violating the SDGs.
Good morning, good afternoon everyone. Despite an active involvement in these fishing activities by the fisherwomen, the condition of life faced by these fisherwomen is extensively different from that of the fishermen. This includes long working hours, poor wages as compared to the men, and also the additional burden of household maintenance, which Harley Oakshire calls as the second shift. Poverty eradication, which apparently is the most important goal of the Sustainable Development Goals and is assumed to be a magical pill for all maladies, has been implemented by several national and international governments. The belief that this goal can solve a lot of problems is further strengthened when we look at the various welfare schemes and the poverty alleviation schemes that are directed towards the poor. But there happens to be a major problem in these schemes. There has been a repeated failure and incompetency, if I may say so, on the part of the government for recognizing and addressing the grievances of the fisherwomen when compared to the fishermen. The benefits of the schemes that is provided during the ban and the lean period, a period the consequences of which are felt equally by all involved in the fishing activities, is specifically directed for the men and not for the fisherwomen. The invisibilizing of their labor is a blatant violation of the 5th and the 10th goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. Not recognizing the contribution of these fisherwomen is leading to the loss of the traditional method of sale and of the fishes, which is a major blow to the recognition of the identity of the fisherwoman as the whole. Going back to what Professor Marx and Professor Sengupta mentioned, that these SDGs have an underlying assumption and an underlying theme, which is to not leave behind anyone. But despite being one of the early signatories to these sustainable development goals, India has constantly, the policies and the schemes directed by the government has constantly left behind these fisherwomen. As students of policy, what we've tried to highlight and understand through this situation is that is it rational and sustainable to have policies and schemes that differentiate the same labor solely because they are carried out by different gender. Now, Sheetal will shed more light on the importance of inclusive policies with respect to human rights.
Apart from being an assault to human dignity, poverty is also a blatant human rights violation, especially if it's caused by the government's failure to act, as is in the case of the fishermen of Udupi. The right to life under Article 21 of the Constitution of India has broadly been interpreted to include all rights essential for a decent life, including the right to livelihood. The Supreme Court in 1985, in the case of Olga Dallas versus the Bombay Municipal Corporation, interpreted the right to life to be inclusive of the right to livelihood as well. Fishing, being a traditional occupation, warrants protection from the state under the right to life that not only ensures intervention during crisis, but also implement welfare-oriented measures for those engaged in all fishing and fishing-related activities. Women who are primarily engaged in these allied activities such as peeling, selling, distributing, etc. are sidelined from both the compensation and the welfare schemes. And this shows the government's failure to recognize their work and the contribution to the fishing sector. Women's work has been constantly regarded as reproductive work or work that is mainly undertaken to sustain their families. While the fishermen go out to sea to catch fish, women are engaged in other offshore fishing related activities. And yet, all benefits are granted only to the men. And this shows that only fishermen's work is considered as economic activity. Apart from the spatial differences in their work, they are both an integral part of the fishing sector. And this means that they're equally affected by the ban and lean periods as well and are entitled to the same welfare benefits. Women are disproportionately affected by poverty and they represent 70% of the world's poor. And women perform 66% of the world's work, produce 50% of the food, but earn only 10% of the income and own just 1% of the property. Despite all this, we see that there is an inadequate response from the government to tackle the poverty of women. Could this be because women contribute to the state in terms of revenue and in comparison are lesser to what men contribute? This is the question that we need to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, for doing that great presentation, and big applause to you. And I request Professor Kaveri to give you excellent marks when it comes to the exam at the end of the semester. Our final speaker is Dipanshu Mohan, the assistant professor in the School of International Affairs.
All right, I know I'm the only wall separating you from lunch, and it's been a very intense discussion for the last 2 days talking about what or how the future holds to be on the implementation of what we call as sustainable development goals. These terms, sustainable development, inclusive development, decentralized development, we keep talking about it, but we still have a very misconstrued understanding in mainstream literature on how we conceptualize the framework of development as well. We still not have a consensus of that. So I'll operate for the next 10 to 12 minutes from a degree of abstraction here, and I'll not discuss anything which has to do specifically with sustainable development goals per se, but largely focus on what the 2030 development agenda may not look like, but how is that we can probably take a more nuanced way of understanding it using different methods. So I would rather probably experiment a little bit on the methodology of our assessment. And that starts with basically how the last presentation ended. We had 5 or 4 distinguished speakers giving each of their voices about an issue which has a common concern. And that's the area which I would probably want to start with. by being more constructive, um, but do something which is some understated in the domain of economic reasoning and analytics. That's where we don't often use what we can classify as narratives in enhancing our understanding of basic concepts. Most of the people sitting in the room, not in the periphery of the round table, but those outside, are going to be leading the agenda forward by 2030. By then, basically, it's the students who are sitting right here would be in the decision-making domain. So it's important that we also experiment a little bit with methods, because the concerns may be common to pre-existing times, but the methods in which we may have to look at it may want some revision. So I start by talking about what is a theoretical framework I've given some thought over the last year, and this is largely going to look at policy making as not a technical or technocratic exercise of implementation alone, but look at more from an intuitive level, because you can have understanding of technical nature and one which is more intuitive, and that's somehow where economic analysis has found a lot of diversion towards techniques and models as against not looking at the intuition. So if we can look at policy making in a more intuitive way and experiment a little bit by talking about the larger goal or reason behind the axioms or illustrations we use, how is that we can induct a more narrative-based framework? What do I mean by narratives? Let's start by looking at a database we often refer to for classical studies. If you just put the word narrative in a JSTOR database and you want to do a search by each discipline, one wouldn't be surprised by seeing that the most often used word of narrative comes in fields of anthropology, history, to a certain extent in psychology, sociology, but the least in the two areas which seem to be more focused upon in, for example, what I could gauge from the whole SDG and MDG discussion as well. You need to work on data, you need to work on indicators, and that's something which you'd have to depend on economists to look at. But econs also don't look at narratives the way they bear it to be. We do acknowledge, however, that a change in economic decision making that does happen at a political level or in whatever sense, or even in our preferences that we have on a day-to-day basis, is shaped by changing narratives. There's an acknowledgement of that, but to what extent these popular narratives are making us to change our decision making, the reverse order of that is not given enough weightage. So let's see where is that economics, if not finance, because finance is definitely more technical, where economics can use a bit more of it. So let's start with the framework, which we can probably, and this is a non-exhaustive category. We can widen the framework and we can add more perspectives here. And it is going to take probably another year for me to be able to think of what could be a more restricted domain of knowledge framework. So in a policy knowledge framework, the first set of, in any designing any given policy, which is for a collective purpose or a public good, whatever we may acknowledge, is the first thing that we would want to satisfy is a set of comprehensive outcomes. Now, what does that mean is we'll identify those comprehensive outcomes which are largely process-driven in nature. When I use the word process-driven, that means you have a policy, but you're really concerned about how that is going to be implemented. What are the agencies that are going to be involved in the implementation exercise of that particular policy, and whether the feasibility criteria for these agencies to be inducted are being met. So in other words, you have a situation where if you have a policy, if I take an example of the current goods and services tax in India, you would really want to see whether your agencies which are capable of determining what the tax slab should be, those who are required to collect for tax, as against also who are going to be vigilant about the fact that those who are not paying taxes, how is that going to work? In other words, how the bureaucracy is going to play out. That's the first center point where comprehensive outcomes would need to be outlined. And that would be mapped with your feasibility constraints. Popular saying goes is politics is largely about the art of rhetoricism, while budget is mostly about the art of how feasible rhetoricism may work. So you'll have to put money behind the words that you're saying. But comprehensive outcomes would largely be looking at process-driven work.
The second set of outcomes which we can probably identify are the desired goals of a given policy. You want to have a goods and services tax, or you would want to work towards a better tax system because you want good revenue to be able to then distribute it in selected goals. These would be culmination outcomes. I think somewhere the set of culmination outcomes and comprehensive outcomes get often mixed. We kind of say that, well, we want to curb black money creation, we want to avoid people from not paying or evading taxes, get them corrected. That's the desired goal, but we don't have the agencies put in place to be able to rectify it. I think there's a need to probably separate these two as against the other. So whether your culmination outcomes are being met, and that's something which would require periodic feedback. The third is a common concept used in welfare economics. Just the basic example to explain is if the satisfaction of one individual group, that is, let's say group A, is the target group who you want to get better off over a period of time as a result of the implementation, you would want to see that the improvement in the livelihood of that group, which is the target group, does not drastically reduce the livelihood mechanisms of the other, right? In other words, basically reach an optimal criteria where if, for example, if you want to supply water to a selected group of farmers who do not have access to waters and are suffering in a drought, you don't do it in a way in which you don't leave out any water for other groups of farmers there as well. And that's something which we often want to strike with the Pareto optimal criteria. There's enough literature which says that it's impossible to strike an Pareto optimal criteria, but that's an envisaged framework that you would want to induct in the design of policy making, right? You can't look at it. The last is, which is now a lot of behavioral economists are working on for the last almost 30 years, is how is that state, or in other words, the agency of the state, can ensure certain outcomes to be met, which is, let's say, the culmination outcomes, by using some mechanism by which they really don't impose themselves. It's like kind of not doing it the Leviathan way, in the sense that absolutely this is the paternalistic way of doing it and that's the way you'd have to do it. Well, can you induct a little bit more of a soft push libertarian paternalism? And that's something which Richard Thaler's work highlights, that if you want to make people to get the right set of incentives, well, you would want to give them more incentives or tax rebates to be able to pay for taxes. So if you want people to save more, why not increase your rebates for putting fixed deposits in a certain account? That's the way you would get more savings brought about. So you can nudge your way around and allow for that. That's the framework. Now, if this is the framework that we want a good and effective policy to work at a national level or a global level, I'm often skeptical on global levels as well, because there is always this justice and this Hobbesian dilemma of a justice and sovereignty divide. So let's maybe say at a national level or a domestic level, you have a given policy. These are the set of frameworks we can probably identify. As I said, it's not a non-exhaustive one. But where do narratives fit in this? And that's basically the summative part of the discussion I wanted to have today, is that where narratives become extremely important is giving us the perspectives of the fishermen or fisherwoman in Udupi, right? We do get a humanist perspective, whether a given set of policies are actually making any impact or not for the group that you would want to do well. And that's through the stories that do evoke certain human interest and emotion. And that's how you would find any changes to be happening at either a legal level or even what you'd say economists would be invested in doing. So the first thing narratives would do in diagnosing policy effectiveness would be in providing a humanist perspective. That's the first thing, because econs also live in societies. They're not outside the framework. Maybe we may want to envisage that, but that's not true. Second is that of a contextual perspective. Now, that's the major critique that is put, where you have a bunch of people sitting in, let's not put DC, but let's say Mozambique, and deciding set of policies for the rest of the world. You don't really have a better perspective on what are the social or the cultural factors that are really important. In India's case, for example, the worst period for per capita income growth was between the 70s and the 80s. That was seen to be for the longest time. But perhaps that's the time where our household savings level were at its highest. That's an irony and a paradox that we've been able to see, because people naturally save. If you get 100 rupees, we want to put the 10 aside and say that, okay, now our expenses are going to be out of the 90, not from the 100. So That's a cultural factor that has allowed our propensity to save or saving to increase. So contextual perspectives are really important in bringing the effectiveness of a given policy out. The third, as I said, was on talking about behavioral perspective. If a state is found to be really centralized, unilateral, overarching in nature, you would see that somehow the feedback received from a policy would give you that perspective. What do I mean by a feedback? Well, you would want to see in the pilot testing stage of a given policy how that is rolling out. In the first 3 months, you'd feel there is some kind of a short-term cost that's imposed, but let's say that normalizes over the next 6 months. But you would want to get regular feedbacks from people. So let's say in the case of a goods and services tax, you want to know whether small and marginal businessmen, which is 85% of the firm that we have, are they able to provide and get easy mechanisms for paying taxes? So that's the periodic feedback system that we may work through a nudging policy. The last, which is in terms of bringing the agency perspective in more light, is if you have a policy where people in the Prime Minister's office would decide how is that you can curb for hoarding of black money and do not bring in the perspective of those who are going to implement the policy, which is, let's say, largely the banks who are going to be ensuring, which was something that was expected in the demonetization scenario, you would see that agencies would be left out of the loop and those comprehensive outcomes would be missing out primarily. So you may have outcomes culminating, but agencies would be left out of the loop and the processes would not be following that. So this is largely a framework that if we have to really experiment with our way of thinking and reasoning in the domain of economic analysis primarily, using the data that we have, I think the role of the institutions that we have or are present becomes very important for getting those narratives out, because that's how over a period of time, what, for example, we say really works in China may work in India, or what works in India may work in really China. You can't compare contextual perspectives in both countries, but you can identify certain narratives in which, for example, if you have a pricing mechanisms that work really well for agricultural farmers in China, the way they kind of introduced a dual market liberalization strategy in the 80s, that's a framework which, having closely studied, I feel works really well for some of the mechanisms. It's been done in the cooperative sector already in cases of milk businesses in Gujarat and Maharashtra. But you would want to kind of experiment constantly and get these narratives out to get the policy effectiveness going in different levels. I'll stop there, and I think we'll have questions.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for discussion and questions to our excellent panelists. And then I will give the floor to a vote of thanks to Sushant. So who would like to? Yes, Vinod, please.
Brief comment for Kaveri and for students. This particular work took place in Dakshin Kannada and Udupi. These are among the most prosperous districts of the state of Karnataka. They are also the ones with the highest levels of human development indicators. In fact, when the state HDR was being discussed, exercises showed that if you take these districts out, then Karnataka would appear as a Bihar state. So the difference in the HDR status between these districts and others is huge. Another point is that this particular fisherman community is politically very powerful. These districts are politically influential and this community is powerful. One of them has been Chief Minister of the state, Veerappa Moily. And currently the Fisheries Minister is one of them. So the question I have is it the state that is patriarchal, or is it those powerful male politicians from this community who are powerful? How do you situate it? Because based on how you do it, based on how you look at it, the kind of policies you suggest would change.
True, it's one of the most prosperous parts of Karnataka, and true that overall, on an overall basis, if you take it, the human development there in that region is much better than the other parts of Karnataka. But having said that, we cannot homogenize this group of fishermen. There are, much more prosperous big sellers who do extremely well economically and financially, but then you see that the majority of those who are selling fish are actually extremely poor. They are all below poverty line. They all hold, BPL cards. In my work, over the last 2 years, I've observed that it's about between 70 to 80% of the fisherwomen actually hold BPL cards and live in very, very precarious conditions and obtain very, very low wages. So I think it's important to, in a certain sense, understand that when you're talking about the prosperity of that region, that it's also that there's a lot of caste distinction between the different caste groups. There are very wealthy landed caste groups in that part of Karnataka, and it's quite possible that the human development is pushed up because of these landed castes. While these fisherwomen belong to the fourth caste, that's the Shudras. True, the fisheries minister at present is from the Mogavida caste himself. His mother actually was the more important politician in the area. She was successfully elected as the MLA in the region, I think for the last 7 or 8 terms, if I'm right. But having said that, there are differences within these groups. I already pointed out to you that there are very wealthy fisherwomen. On the other hand, you see that the majority actually are extremely poor. They're small sellers. So there's a distinction between the small and the big sellers. I just want to add one more note, which could not come through because of the limited time. I think the girls kept excellent time. They were within 15-minute despite. I was a bit worried because 4 of them were present.
We should learn from them.
So I just wanted to add that in this case, what we see is this, paternalistic approach of the state, and you also see the way in which one SDG is played against another. This SDG to promote livelihoods, primarily they pick poverty reduction. Consistently, when the state supports these fisherwomen, they make it seem like they're doing them a great favor. They say, oh my God, you're so poor, so we will ensure that there are no supermarkets in the region. We will not award licenses so that you can continue selling fish. But on the other hand, what they do is, even within the community, they prioritize fishermen for all of the subsidies and benefits. Fishermen are often also, most of the fishermen within this community have own small boats, medium boats, large boats, so they're also owners of different sorts. So there is a certain amount of accumulation that takes place amongst the fishermen, which necessarily does not feed into the family welfare as well as the welfare of the women. So culturally you have these norms where the woman actually takes care of the family and the family's needs, and the man accumulates for himself most often, So the rhetoric amongst these fisherwomen is that, oh yes, I earn, my husband also earns, but whatever he earns, he puts back into his business, whatever I earn goes into my home. So you see the manner in which actually, the state also buys into this kind of rhetoric and prefers subsidies for example, diesel subsidies, which are provided to boats and boat owners. On the other hand, you have fish markets, which are provided to women, which they have to rent out. They have to pay a rent, a daily rent of 25 rupees. And no refrigeration facilities, no subsidized electricities, they have to pay electricity bills, etc. So you see that distinction, and you see the manner in which the state is preferring one sort of goal and often hides behind this goal and says, well, we are doing poverty reduction. On the other hand, equality, like you said, goes out of the window. It's a goal that, that is political and therefore does not have to be attempted.
I have a question for you, but I'll answer for this one. We want to. Okay, I think what I would like to ask both Dr. Sengupta and Trinanjan is you mentioned that somehow for some states it's cherry picking and easy to find issues they do well and somehow report those instead of to go into the challenges. And that not only India, every state probably will do the same kind of hypocritical approach. which is exactly against the spirit of the SDG. The states should deal with the challenges rather than to try to show off. As you said, they pick up 7 out of the 17 and they make a very nice presentation. So here I think is the role of the civil. This is where civil society should pinch and should really demand answers on the difficult issues, not to take, because mostly we have inequality not only between states. So SDGs are not about poor countries in Africa. It's about every country, as you pointed out. Canada has huge problems. Yesterday, Steve Marks pointed to Philip Alston data about 40 millions in the United States that are under the poverty line. So SDGs are not for poor countries, they're for every country. They have to address inequalities within them. But I wonder, in the climate change regime, we have something very interesting, which is called facilitation mechanisms. So somehow the waiting for states to report will be one approach, and they can be definitely scrutinized by the civil society. But there should be facilitation mechanisms where states do not worry to go into the challenging area and simply seek assistance where they need assistance to address those more difficult issues. Otherwise, if it is simply monitoring and reporting, then we naturally move to a stage of easy fixes and easy issues. But to have an international facilitation mechanism that can invite states to report problems without worry that they will look bad, they will need to really focus on those issues. I think that is something I find myself missing. Trinanjo.
Thank you. First off, I think, Kaveri, the format in which you presented, I think it's truly SDG and inclusive, because obviously, like, work done is done by many and not just one. But I think, the question that you posed to her, and it really sort of captures what I alluded to, and some others also poked at it, which is that the whole idea of aggregated data and the need for disaggregation. Because yes, you look at the district, it's the richest district, but then you have something which is as real as this, that the women are probably the poorest, 80% below BPL. And I think that's what Deepak also was saying in the previous session, and many of us have said it, and even more, have been talking about it in the data sort of regime, is that this disaggregation is becoming a massive issue, because without that, huge swathes of population are just getting sort of rolled over. It's the same thing that we had already recognized in the economic sphere of like GDP. GDP is good for World Bank data sets, but it doesn't tell you anything. And just to sort of I'm thinking the privilege of having a mic already now. Is that Dipanshu, I think before I was dabbling in human rights and government bashing, I used to sort of fondle with words like epistemology and ontology, so like your presentation was extremely interesting. And what you said about narratives, it sort of occurs least in economics and finance, and you're completely right. But I also feel that it's slightly changing now. SDGs is not just about, yes, it often seems that SDGs is about data as an indicator and all the numerical stuff. But I think the kind of new kind of indicator that are coming up in SDG, just for example, I'll use under Goal 16, there is an indicator which says number of people who feel safe walking in the neighborhood at night, which you just cannot measure by fonts. And so there is a shift happening, where you are looking more towards qualitative data. The methodologies of it are also changing. You can't just do some sort of objective survey. It has to be a more subjective issue. Also, goal 4.7, which I think mentioned offhandedly, is about education, which is of global citizenship, human rights. Now these are not really sort of quantitative measures that you can have. We can only give you the outcomes not in the period of 2030, but in post-2030 period. So I think there is a trend. Unfortunately, it's not enough. It needs to be more, and hopefully post-2030 agenda will be, where it comes to fruition.
Yes, Dr. Mito Singleton, and then Maharaj.
So I just wanted to follow up on what you said, and it was so intriguing and exciting to just hear about the citizen-generated data. And I was just wondering how receptive you found the government, and what have your interactions with the government been around this?
Dipashu?
Yeah, no, well, that's a narrative, what you're coming up with, that the narrative of SDGs is changing because it was seen with the Millennium Development Goals that when you have very specific indicators, very specific data-driven points, it does not actually lead to the desired results, and that means your comprehensive outcomes, but not looking at the combination outcomes. There was a mismatching. That's fine. I just find this comparison between, I think I can probably make that distinction between qualitative and quantitative methods very clearly. When you make a comparison, for example, this country is doing better than the other, you're already comparing the quantitative, like using some ranking as a method, you're ranking one against the other, and that in a domain of reasoning would be seen in a mathematical construct. It's just that you don't really need to narrow down and get into the framework of using, let's say, what you would call as quantifying it to the extent that you just lose the perspective altogether. So there is enough in terms of a mixed methodology framework that comes out, and I think that's the objective. You have a certain set of rules and principles, so you get an incomplete ordering of a desired result, and you get a partially complete ordering, and you get a complete ordering. That is how you rank it. So that's absolutely fine, and the new indicators coming in, let's say in drivers of inequality, which is a lot of institutions working on, are trying to look at it. They don't look at number of policemen per 1,000 people, don't look at number of doctors per 1,000 people. In fact, why don't you look at it the geographical proximity based, in the sense that you have a particular institution right here. What is the closest destination to which you have a doctor who can provide you a service for what periods of time? Again, so now you have a qualitative perspective, what you would call in a certain way of a narrative, that in this country, in this district, in this situation, that's what is happening, and get the information out there to be able to replicate. I think we live in an age of information overload and an extremity of an information asymmetry. So the virtue of dealing with that lies somewhere in the middle of dealing with the overload of the asymmetry.
Radhika.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to something you said, Professor, that monitoring is something that the civil society should do for the kind of indicators that we're missing out on, or the contest of one goal against the other. But at the same time, since we're discussing strategies for prioritizing the 2030 agenda, there is not enough scope as of now for the civil society to present what we're monitoring. All of our monitoring stays in the form of shadow reports, which is limited to side events. It is not something that is being presented at the high-level political forum, and it is also not something that the government of India is open to. Like we said, that they're not even open to questions during their presentation. So I would actually advocate for all of us actually coming together and advocate for more spaces for all of us to be able to present this kind of data. That would be really
Absolutely admirable. Fully agree. This needs to be a strong effort, and academia is included. Universities should do also their part in the series.
That kind of study would be very, very helpful.
We're a bit out of time. Oh, sorry, Steve. Sorry. Take as much time as you need.
No,
sorry.
Because I am really the barrier between you and lunch, and I've got so much to say. It was a really rich discussion.
Please.
I guess I could tick off some points. I need to digest yours a lot more before responding to, but I would like to pick up on something that me too started with, quoting Jeff Sachs. Advantages of a non-binding document as a basis for having a more comprehensive commitment. And it relates to something that in international law we call compliance pull and compliance push. And there are ways in which compliance pull can be the existence of the norm, the awareness of it, can move behaviors in the desired direction. Whereas if you've got compliance push, you have a legal obligation, you have to report your accountability, we're going to have this procedure against you and so on. Governments won't commit to those types of things. And we've encountered that, and I have to mention this at the last day because Neetu is here and Rajiv was here yesterday. Of course, there is one international human rights standard, the Declaration on the Right to Development, that seeks to, happens to be another dean of this university who's trying to reach me, that the right to development was elaborated to be comprehensive and embrace what is now the full range of goals under the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. The resistance to transforming it into a treaty has been ferocious, as we've seen. Could somebody please call her and tell her I'm speaking? Because I do want to shorten this, but I think that compliance pull and compliance push, the example of the failure of the Declaration of the Right to Development, which is supposed to be addressing all of these issues in human rights language, potentially transformable into a treaty norm, is a total and utter complete failure. However, there has been suggested many times, and I think you're monitoring, and I'm dying to hear your answer on that question of how that taking pictures of the ditch for 60 days with a watch in the picture and so on is working, because you forced me to think about two ways in which a difference can be made to align compliance with the SDGs with human rights obligations. I showed yesterday the chart that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights prepared, in which they lined up the goals and targets, and then they lined it up with human rights obligations. References to convention this, with article that, and so on. These are the obligations that are directly relevant to implement. Well, that's important. So I think there are two ways in which we can have the synergy between the legally binding commitments to human rights that are pertinent to the SDGs and the SDG monitoring process through the high-level political forum and the interagency expert group on SDG indicators. The first is that human rights monitoring as such, where it's not included in the indicators, can be introduced both by governments and civil society. For example, when they're talking about gender discrimination and things like that under the relevant goal, say, yes, but Article 5 of CEDAW requires you to do A, B, C, and D. Yes, but in the reporting under CEDAW under Article 5, it was pointed out by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women that you failed to do A, B, C, D. The Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has drawn your attention in the report, reference, etc., to your failure to do A, B, C, and D. That is a way in which, especially civil society, can draw upon the legally binding norms of international human rights and kind of stuff them down the throats of governments who are attempting to ignore them in the ways that you've described. And then the other one, the other direction, is to continue the effort to introduce explicit or implicit human rights referencing in the interagency expert group on SDG indicators. Several indicators, and I tried to point this out yesterday, we take the indicator 1.3.1, is a human rights sensitive indicator relating to gender discrimination and things like that, and the gender and persons with disability. That's human rights relevant. Any human rights person is going to be happy that indicator is there. But we've seen that the effort made by Center for Economic and Social Rights, among others, in publishing the book called The Measure of Progress, How Human Rights Should Inform the Sustainable Development Goals Indicators, is an explicit way to say, here's concretely how we are pushing you to enrich those indicators to make them more human rights relevant. Because we've only got, what have we got? 5 or 10%, I think, from a human rights perspective. We look at the indicators and you're going to say, we're satisfied. No, we're only 5 or 10% there. Good, important at 5 or 10%, but we need to get 90%. And I think these two ways are ways of getting there. My apologies.
No, it's good. Yes, any quick final word from anyone?
We need to find out about that. Those pictures in the ditch.
Yeah, see, I mean, that's what, I think I should have put not the disclaimer that this is an idea right now, and it's and I think it tells you why it's still an idea is when I respond to your question. So far, and it's not just in India, I think it's across the world that citizen-generated data is still sort of an idea which is, or an action which is happening parallelly, but not in a sort of a synchronized manner with government policy. There has been tremendous sort of steps taken, for example, in Kenya, on using citizen-generated data and SMSing, where the telecommunication network and the industry is extremely sort of advanced in East Africa, and so banking, for example, is something that people do on SMSs in Kenya and Tanzania. So they've used that as a methodology for gathering data which is real-time and extremely local. In India, to add one question to your national survey, NSSO survey, costs 1 crore. So obviously, you can't do data, you can't get data on 232 unique indicators on an annual basis. I mean, the country will go bankrupt. So this is another way of getting real-time data, which is extremely micro. But on the other hand, for example, in India, I mean, when conversations have happened, there is a problem. For example, how do you verify that data? I mean, not that government data, and its veracity is, unimpeachable, but that's what we are there for. We are saying that this is not impeachable data, but the government can't take the civil society role and do the same thing that your data is not. I mean, they can't devote the time to, sort of justify or disprove our data. So, I mean, I think it's more of an intellectual place where the conversation has to figure out, because how do we define what is legitimate data? I mean, we often use a lot of data which is government, but we get it through RTI. Is that citizen-generated data? Maybe not. I mean, it's a grey zone because it's all there in the government. It's just that we are, sort of trying it out. So yeah, I mean, so far the CGD, what I mean, in dev parlance, is mainly through RTI, and that becomes legitimate. But if we do our own surveys, for example, our surveys, I mentioned that it's going to be maximum 5,500 people in one city, of a city like Bombay, where we did a crime victimization survey. It was 5,500 people sample size, whereas the population is 22 million. But is it really representative? Obviously not. So I mean, those questions are there. I mean, I think those are questions worth engaging with, but they shouldn't be questions to poke hole in what your outcomes are coming out to be. I mean, that should be a stepping stone and not a conversation ender.
Excellent. Thank you all for this excellent panel. We really enjoy all your presentations, and let's give us a big applause. And then,